The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Courtroom 3B, casting harsh shadows across the polished wooden benches. 7-year-old Emma Calloway sat between two strangers, her small legs dangling from the witness chair that seemed designed for someone 3 times her size. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and she wore a blue dress that someone had picked out for her. Probably Janet Miller, her social worker, who sat in the front row with a concerned expression etched across her weathered face. Judge Patricia Wells adjusted her reading glasses and studied the file before her. Emma's case had crossed her desk dozens of times over the past 18 months. Born to a teenage mother who disappeared when Emma was 3, the girl had bounced through 5 different foster homes before landing in the system's temporary care facility. Now, finally, there was hope. Multiple families wanted to adopt her permanently. "Your Honor," announced David Cross, straightening his expensive tie as he rose from the plaintiff's table. "My clients, Robert and Linda Henderson, have provided a loving, stable home for Emma these past 4 months. They've invested emotionally and financially in her well-being, enrolling her in private school, providing therapy, and—" "Objection to the characterization," interrupted Margaret Foster, representing the rival adoptive family. "The Hendersons may have means, but the Patterson family has demonstrated genuine emotional connection with the child. Emma has expressed preference for—" "That's enough." Judge Wells's voice cut through the courtroom like a gavel strike. She had presided over family court for 15 years, and the sight of adults arguing over a child as if she were property never ceased to frustrate her. "This isn't an auction. We're here to determine what's in Emma's best interest." Emma's hands remained folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the polished floor. She had learned long ago that staying quiet and small made bad things end faster. The voices of the adults washed over her like ocean waves, loud, overwhelming, and impossible to stop. Janet Miller shifted in her seat, watching Emma's rigid posture with growing concern. In her 20 years as a social worker, she had seen that particular stillness before. It wasn't the normal shyness of a child in court. It was something deeper, something that made her stomach clench with worry. "The Henderson family has provided stability," Cross continued, gesturing toward his clients. Robert Henderson sat with military posture, his graying temples making him look distinguished in his navy suit. Linda Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the picture of maternal concern. Emma's breathing quickened slightly when she heard their names, though she didn't look up. Judge Wells noticed. After years on the bench, she had developed an instinct for reading children. Emma's reaction wasn't excitement or relief at hearing about her potential permanent family. It was something else entirely. "I think," Judge Wells said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the now silent courtroom, "it's time we heard from Emma herself." The adults fell silent. Emma's head lifted slightly, her wide green eyes meeting the judge's kind gaze for the first time since entering the room. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Judge Wells asked gently. "Is there anything you'd like to tell us?" The courtroom tension was palpable as Margaret Foster stood to address Judge Wells. "Your Honor, while the Hendersons may appear suitable on paper, the Patterson family has demonstrated a genuine emotional bond with Emma. During supervised visits, she showed clear signs of comfort and trust." Robert Henderson's jaw tightened. "That's completely unfounded," he muttered to his wife, though his voice carried in the quiet room. Emma's small frame tensed at the sound of his voice. Her hands, previously folded calmly, began to tremble slightly. Janet Miller noticed the change immediately, making a note on her pad. "The Hendersons have provided Emma with her own bedroom, tutoring support, and access to the best child psychologists in the state," Cross argued. "Robert Henderson is a respected businessman, and Linda has taken leave from her teaching position to focus entirely on Emma's needs." "Material provisions aren't everything," Foster shot back. "Emma needs emotional security, not just financial." "Stability. The Pattersons have 2 other adopted children who have thrived in their care." Judge Wells watched Emma carefully throughout the exchange. The child's breathing had become shallow, and she kept glancing toward the exit as if planning an escape route. Something was very wrong. Furthermore, Cross continued, raising his voice, my clients have invested significant time and resources. Emma has been living with them for 4 months. Disrupting that stability would be traumatic. At the word living, Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something that looked distinctly like fear. Judge Wells made her own note. Linda Henderson dabbed at her eyes again. We love her so much, she whispered loudly enough for the court reporter to hear. She's already part of our family. Robert's brother visits regularly, and he adores Emma. She calls him Uncle Robert. Emma went rigid. The name hung in the air, like a poison cloud. Emma's face had gone completely white, and her small hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles showed through her pale skin. Janet Miller half rose from her seat, alarm bells ringing in her head. She had seen this reaction before, too many times. The child seems distressed, Foster observed, seizing the moment. Perhaps this environment isn't as nurturing as represented. She's simply overwhelmed by the formal setting, Cross dismissed. It's natural for any child. But Judge Wells was studying Emma's face intently. The girl's lips were pressed together in a thin line, and tears had begun to form in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of barely contained terror. I think, Judge Wells said slowly, her instincts screaming that something was terribly amiss. We need to take a different approach. Here, she looked directly at Emma, her voice becoming gentle but firm. Emma, sweetheart, I know this is scary, but sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Sometimes we don't see what's really happening. The courtroom fell completely silent. Is there something you need to tell us? The judge asked softly. Emma sat frozen in the witness chair, her entire body trembling like a leaf in a storm. The courtroom felt enormous around her small frame, filled with faces staring expectantly. Judge Wells had asked her a real question, not the fake kind that adults usually asked when they didn't really want to hear the answer. Her throat felt like sandpaper. For so long, she had kept the terrible secret locked away in the darkest corner of her mind, telling herself that no one would believe her anyway. Adults had their own version of truth, and it rarely included believing children. But something in Judge Wells's eyes was different. Patient, kind, safe. Emma, the judge said again, her voice barely above a whisper. You can tell me anything. I promise you're safe here. Emma's gaze flickered toward the Hendersons. Linda was smiling encouragingly, but there was something tight around her eyes. Robert sat perfectly still, but Emma could see a muscle jumping in his jaw, the same tick she had learned to recognize as a warning sign. The memories flooded back. The basement room where no one could hear her cry, the promises that no one would believe her, the threats about what would happen if she ever told. But Uncle Robert wasn't here now. It was just his name that haunted this room. Emma's voice came out as barely a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't want to go back. Back where, sweetheart? Judge Wells asked gently. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to continue. The adults in the room leaned forward, sensing something monumental was about to happen. To Uncle Robert, she whispered. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Linda Henderson's hand flew to her mouth. David Cross went pale. Margaret Foster's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Uncle Robert? Judge Wells repeated carefully. Can you tell me more about Uncle Robert? Emma's voice grew steadier, as if speaking his name had broken some invisible dam inside her. He comes to the house when Mr. and Mrs. Henderson aren't there. He does bad things. He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me because he's family and I'm just a foster kid nobody wants. Robert Henderson shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is preposterous. She's obviously been coached. Sit down, Mr. Henderson, Judge Wells commanded, her voice like steel. Emma, what kind of bad things? Emma looked directly at the judge, her young voice carrying the weight of months of hidden terror. He touches me in places that hurt and make me feel sick. He makes me touch him too. He says it's our special secret and that all uncles do this with their special girls. The courtroom erupted. Linda Henderson began sobbing. David Cross was frantically whispering to his clients. Margaret Foster was already reaching for her phone. Judge Wells struck her gavel hard 3 times. Bailiff, please escort Mr. and Mrs. Henderson to the hallway immediately. Clerk, call 911 and Child Protective Services emergency line. Now. Emma sat in her chair, no longer trembling but looking somehow both smaller and stronger than before. She had spoken the unspeakable and the sky hadn't fallen. The adults were finally listening. You did the right thing, Emma, Judge Wells said softly as chaos swirled around them. You are so very brave. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of interviews, medical examinations, and careful questioning by trained specialists. Emma was immediately placed in emergency protective custody with the Riverside Children's Center, where Dr. Amanda Torres, a pediatric trauma specialist, worked gently to help her process what had happened. Detective Ray Morrison had seen, too, many cases like this one, but Emma's courage still amazed him. In the safe environment of the Children's Center, with Dr. Torres by her side, Emma slowly revealed the full scope of Robert Henderson's abuse. The pattern had started within weeks of her placement with the family, escalating whenever his brother and Linda left the house. She's been living in survival mode, Dr. Torres explained to Detective Morrison and Janet Miller during their case conference. The psychological manipulation was extensive. He convinced her that no one would believe her, that she'd be sent back to worse places if she spoke up. Classic predator behavior. Meanwhile, the investigation was expanding rapidly. Robert Henderson had been arrested within hours of Emma's revelation, but Detective Morrison's team was discovering this wasn't an isolated case. A search of Henderson's home and electronics revealed disturbing evidence pointing to other potential victims. We've identified at least 3 other children who may have been targeted, Detective Morrison informed the team. 2 former foster children who were briefly placed with the Hendersons, and 1 neighborhood child whose parents trusted him to babysit. The revelation sent shockwaves through the adoption community. How had such a dangerous individual slipped through the screening process? How many other children might be at risk in homes where background checks had missed critical warning signs? Linda Henderson, meanwhile, was grappling with her own devastating realization. I knew something was wrong, she confided to her sister during one of their tear-filled conversations. Emma would get so quiet whenever Robert visited. I told myself she was just shy, but deep down, God help me, I think I knew and I didn't want to see it. Emma's bravery had a ripple effect. Within days of the arrest becoming public, 2 other children came forward with their own stories of abuse by Robert Henderson. Their courage, inspired by Emma's example, helped prosecutors build an even stronger case. At the Children's Center, Emma was slowly beginning to heal. Art therapy sessions revealed the depth of her trauma, but also her remarkable resilience. Her drawings evolved from dark, cramped images to brighter scenes with open skies and smiling faces. I want to help other kids, Emma told Dr. Torres during one of their sessions, so they know they can tell someone and people will believe them. Judge Wells visited Emma personally, something she rarely did outside of court. You saved yourself, Emma, she told the young girl, and you probably saved other children too. That takes incredible courage. The legal machinery was now in full motion. Robert Henderson faced multiple felony charges, and the case was building toward what prosecutors believed would be a landmark conviction. Emma's single word in that courtroom had not only saved her own life, it had potentially saved many others. But for Emma, the most important victory was simpler. She was learning to trust again, one day at a time. 6 months later, Emma stood in a different courtroom, but this time the atmosphere was filled with hope rather than fear. Judge Wells smiled down at her from the bench as the adoption papers were signed, making her placement with the Morrison family, Detective Ray Morrison and his wife Sarah, officially permanent. The Morrisons weren't a typical adoptive family. Ray had been so moved by Emma's case that he and his wife, a former social worker, had requested to be considered as her permanent guardians. They understood trauma, had experience with healing, and most importantly, they saw Emma not as a victim, to be pitied, but as a survivor to be celebrated. Robert Henderson had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The trial had been difficult, but Emma's testimony, delivered via closed-circuit television with Dr. Torres beside her, had been the key to securing justice. Her words were clear, honest, and devastating in their simplicity. The hardest part, Emma had told the prosecutor during preparation, was thinking that no one would believe me because I'm just a kid. But kids know things too. We know when something's wrong. Linda Henderson had divorced her husband immediately after his arrest and entered therapy to understand how she had failed to protect Emma. She wrote Emma a letter of apology that Dr. Torres helped Emma read when she was ready. While forgiveness would be a long journey, Emma was learning that healing didn't require forgetting. It required moving forward. The case had also sparked systemic changes. Judge Wells had advocated for new protocols requiring private interviews with children in all adoption proceedings, ensuring their voices were heard separately from the adults making decisions about their lives. Emma's courage had literally changed the law. Now, as Emma settled into life with the Morrisons, she was discovering what a real family felt like. There were no secrets, no fear, no walking on eggshells. When Ray came home from work, Emma ran to hug him, something that would have been impossible months earlier. "I want to be a judge someday," Emma announced one evening as Sarah helped her with homework. "Like Judge Wells, so I can make sure kids get listened to." Sarah smiled, thinking of how far this brave little girl had come. "You'd make an excellent judge, Emma. You already know the most important part, that everyone deserves to have their truth heard." 10 years later, Emma Morrison graduated valedictorian of her high school class. Her speech to the graduating class included a line that made Judge Wells, sitting in the audience, wipe tears from her eyes. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak a single word of truth. Even when you're scared, even when you're small, even when you think no one will believe you." Emma went on to study law, specializing in children's advocacy. She kept a photo on her desk from that day in Judge Wells's courtroom, not from the moment of her testimony, but from afterward, when she was sitting with Janet Miller, smiling for the first time in months. The little girl who had once been too frightened to speak had found her voice. And with that voice, she continued to change the world, one case at a time, ensuring that no child would ever suffer in silence the way she once had. Her single word had become a lifetime of advocacy, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power to transform the world.